Before the PlayStation was even a glint in their eyes, Sony had had some pretty ecstatic highs and some pretty catastrophic lows. They'd made the world's first portable music player, the Sony Walkman, sort of like a caveman's iPod. But they'd also made the Betamax video player, which was popular for a week in 1983. In the mid-80s, they were making and losing vast amounts of money, and they were too busy doing that to be worried about video games. But one of their employees was interested. His name was Ken Kutaragi. He'd watched his daughter play on a NES, and when Nintendo needed someone to build a sound chip for their new console, he offered his services. Sony were pretty angry about this, but reluctantly they let him finish the job, and when he did, Ken was hooked. He persuaded Sony to help him build a CD-ROM for the SNES, a SNES CD. This was pretty exciting, and Sony unveiled this SNES CD, which they called the PlayStation, in 1991. However, soon after this, Nintendo dropped the project and went with Sony's rival, Philips, instead. Sony were furious. They decided that they'd never forget this terrible betrayal and that they'd develop a console to rival Nintendo's if it was the last thing they did. And what did Philips do? They made the CDI, possibly the worst console ever made. So, well done there, lads. Good choice, Nintendo. Good work all round. By now, Ken Kutaragi's job at Sony was to make Nintendo wish he'd never been born, but that wasn't an easy ride. When the grey box launched in Japan in 1994, the critics were well and truly silenced. Games around launch included Ridge Racer, Destruction Derby, Twisted Metal, Wipeout and Tekken. These were brash, edgy, cool, more adult than the Nintendo 64's launch titles like Pilot Wings and Super Mario. Even cuddly mascot Crash Bandicoot was a badass. In one TV advert, a guy in a Crash costume stands outside Nintendo HQ shouting obscenities with a megaphone until removed by security. Have that, Mario! Sony smashed the Sega Saturn, swept aside the N64 and became the first console to sell over 1 million units. Not bad for its first go, and a tough act to follow, right? Well, the PS2 arrived in the year 2000 and duly became the biggest selling console of all time, selling more than the number of Xboxes and Xbox 360s put together. This baby also played DVDs, which took the system out of bedrooms and into living rooms. PS2s only stopped being made in January 2013, and the last PS2 game? FIFA 14. Goodbye, sweet prince. Weird to think that the PS3 has seen its own rise, success and its own demise approach in this protracted lifespan of the PlayStation 2. And let's not forget the PSP. Okay, I'm going to forget the PSP. The PS3's ride was rockiest of all. Incredibly expensive, pretty average launch titles, suffered losses to the 360, then a huge security breach in 2011 which affected basically everyone, before eventually overtaking the 360's sales in May 2013. Let's hope it doesn't suffer the same mistakes this time round. But despite the massiveness of the PS2 and the final triumph of the PlayStation 3, it was the PS1 and its games that had the biggest impact. New titles such as Grand Theft Auto, Resident Evil, Gran Turismo and Tomb Raider made a huge cultural impression, and they're all still going. Existing series like Final Fantasy and Metal Gear took the system to its absolute limits, and in and amongst these, there was still room for more left-field titles like Parappa the Rapper, Tenchu Stealth Assassins, Future Cop LAPD, Vib Ribbon and Grandia. What games! They bring a tear to my eye. Ken Kutaragi's pet project has come a long way since rejection from Nintendo in 1991, and now, 22 years later, here's to the PlayStation 4.